Welcome back to the second lecture today. We have been discussing the relationship between the individual and society. And the point that we had stopped in the last lecture was that in our everyday life, as ordinary members of society, as mothers, fathers, parents, children, teachers, doctors, lawyers, whoever, peasants, working class, employees, factory workers, whoever we are, we very often suffer in our own individual ways. We aspire in our own individual ways. We have desires. We have desires for social mobility. We have desires to move up, to recognize, to achieve certain kind of security and recognition. However, in a world which is increasingly defined by precarious employment conditions, the possibility of losing one's job, the possibility, even with very high degrees, not being able to secure kind of regular employment, a retreat of the state, which would earlier provide us a guaranteed jobs. I belong to a generation from where I benefited. So you retire and you're given certain kind of your pension emoluments, which at the end of 30 or 40 years of work. But all that has changed dramatically in terms of casual employments. Now, many of us, we suffer this, but we are not able to understand the linkage between the macro political, economic, social, cultural change and what is happening in our everyday experience. The sociological imagination, as Mill says, however, enables the possessor to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. It enables him to take into account how individuals in the welter of their daily experience often become falsely conscious of their social position. Now, when you have a sociological consciousness, you realize that these ideas which define our subjectivity, whether it's a sacrificial self, whether it is somebody who wants to assert their individual identity, are both socially constituted. So it's not the fact that only if you're sacrificial, that is socially constituted, but also the fact that if you're agential, if you are aggressive, even that is socially constituted. The fact that men are taught to be aggressive and women are taught to be in self-denial in traditional societies is very much part of what we would call the social construction of the individual or subjectivities. Now, as I mentioned earlier, within this welter of what's happening in the world, we feel personally uneasy, of personally troubled, but we, without the sociological imagination, are not able to transform our personal uneasiness into public issues. However, if I am able, through the reading of sociology, politics, economics, culture, literature, realize that as a woman, living in societies which are primarily patriarchal, that maybe the idea of self-denial, which is part of my subjectivity, is not my issue alone. It's not a personal trouble alone. But many women in most patriarchal society go through this. So in that sense, you suddenly realize that your individual trouble is not something which is accidental, happenstance, just happened over there, bad luck, but something which is transformational. And once you do that, it becomes a public issue. Say in a colonial regime, when people were under British rule in our parts of the world, everybody felt the sense of unfreedom, that in an individual sense of being subjected to a foreign rules, sense of humiliation. But once that sense of humiliation is reorganized as something which impacts everybody, because of the structural presence of colonial rule, it becomes a public issue. It becomes a public movement. It becomes an anti-colonial nationalist movement. It becomes an anti-colonial movement of all sections of people. It becomes, therefore, a public issue. The other point which many of you may have encountered and many of us in our parts of the global south encounter. We feel that in our societies, the individual is very closely linked to the family. We are very attached to our parents, to our cousins, to our grandparents, to siblings, etc. And the Western societies are much more individuated. They're much more driven by the idea of an autonomous sovereign individual. So there have been trends in intellectual thought which would therefore argue Western societies are naturally individualistic, whereas non-Western societies are much more community-oriented or oriented with larger ideas of relational identities with clan, tribe, family, kinship, caste, community, religion, etc. Now, it's very important in sociology not to naturalize anything. Western societies were not always like this, just like our societies were not always like this. We are historically constituted. And in many modern Western societies, traditional communities may have largely disappeared, and almost all social relations, including the family, are very often cast in the mold of civil society. This is both brought in gains and losses. Gains because the individual is more free to negotiate and exercise their freedom, more likely to say no if somebody says you have to get married. And in non-Western societies like ours, the idea of being constrained would be much larger. But there could be other fallouts of being bonded and closely knit, which would give a certain kind of emotional worth and integrity to the individual. So why I say not to dichotomize is because while individualism, the adventure of self-creation and civil society have flourished, communities have declined in many Western societies. Civil societies based on reciprocity, distance, respect for rules, loyalty to institutions. These are good values, important values for democracy and so on. But community or societies based on community relationships have the virtue of intimacy, affection, warmth, and mutual concern. But again, these are absolute black and white dichotomization. Just like the community, the family, the larger kin, the extended family would be a lot of fun getting together, laughing, eating, spending time together. Lot of affection, lot of warmth, lot of mutual concern. But for many young people growing up, it may also be a site of great pressure, intimidation, and even surveillance. Don't dress like this. Don't go out with so-and-so. You must take this kind of education and not this. Don't mix with so-and-so, etc. Where the individual right of the younger person is often subject to the authority of the older generation. But the point that I am trying to convey in all these discussions is that the individual is socially constructed. And each of us construct them through customs, culture, symbolic. We all know how to behave in society, orient what Gates call pervasive orientational necessity. So once I know so-and-so is my friend's father, I automatically treat the friend's father as I would treat a chacha or a mama or a taya. The assumption that how we know how to behave because we have a set of terminologies which define our relationship to people. Once we say so-and-so is a friend, like a brother or sister, the quality of human relationships change. Some, for example, like kinship terminologies, are egocentric. They define the status of an individual in terms of the relationship to a specific social actor. Mama, maternal uncle. In many patrilineal society, where the line of descent is from the father to the son, mama is the place where you get a lot of affection, not authority. It defines the kind of fun relationship you have, whereas in a matrilineal society, the mama may be the line of authority, the father who has no authority but a lot of affection. So you have terminologies, with terminologies, a set of expected behavior and set of values. Likewise, daughter-in-law is supposed in a patrilineal society is supposed to behave in a particular way. A daughter is supposed to be a guest just for a little while in a patrilineal society. When it comes to maybe the father's sister's husband, called a pupa in many parts of North India, the relationship is different. With the son or son-in-law, likewise, it is different. Now, who you are, you could be a son in a particular context, you could be a son-in-law in a particular context, and these relationships associated with associated behavioral patterns help you to orient or negotiate yourself. Those which we discussed just now were kinship terminologies. There are others which are concerned with other subsystems which may be larger. For example, age group. When you say somebody who is the Gao Bura, is not just referring to somebody who is the head of the village, but somebody who belongs to an age group. Higher status, occupational categories, noble ranks. With each individual actors, you have terminologies. In these unequal stratification systems, unequal system like the caste system, very often when you talked about the groups which belong to the higher status, there would be association of dignity, respect, whereas similarly when you look down, so to say, among the so-called depressed communities, the idea would be of looking down from a superior stance. So you notice these relational identities, nomenclature, and capturing of certain kind of behavior. You have a particular kind of names which are personal. For example, when you're a little baby, somebody may call you a Nanu or somebody may call you a Minu, etc., which is personal, very specific to a particular stage in your life. And there are others, in contrast, which are bureaucratic titles, standardizing, designations are formal. For example, the queen, the pandit, the sab, exploring. And when you look at each of these categories, you also realize they're not neutral terminologies. They capture hierarchies and inequalities in existence in society. So therefore, when we talk about the individual as a concept, it is just an insight into the structure of society. It is not enough to learn how to define role or status, which are the different kinds of dimensions of the individual. Symbols, systems, everyday world, labels, somebody is historically constructed. I've sort of flagged off the key terms which I draw from Gates, where he says, the everyday world in which we live are members of any community move. You have a taken for granted field of social action. It's populated not by any bodies, indifferent entities, faceless women and men, but by some bodies. So and so is the very rich man, so and so very poor, the worker in my family, so and so my grandfather's brother. So you have not just naming, but also associated respect, status, privilege, as well as exclusion and discrimination. So it's very important to understand how these are historically constructed, socially maintained, and individually applied. Who you are, what the individual is not given in the nature of things. They are historically constructed, socially maintained, individually applied. Now, I sort of refer to this extraordinarily wonderful book of Gates, where he talks about how in Bali you would have various kinds of nomenclature, and he talks about personal names, birth order names, kinship terms, and teconyms. And this is something we would find similarity with some of our South Asian societies. So the one we talk about, and then finally he talks about caste names, or then you have quasi-occupational titles. Personal names could be something which you refer to as a young child, and you obviously never call your parents or anybody older by their first name. These are personal names, and there's a hierarchy there, and children are more often referred to and on occasion even addressed by their personal names. Personal names are sometimes called child or little names, though once they are mutually bestowed, 105 days after birth, they are maintained unchanged through the whole course of a man's life. In the parts where I grew up, among my linguistic group, among Bengalis, for example, we have a practice of the dark name and the bhalo name, which is the dark is what you are called as a child, and very often as you grow up, fewer and fewer people know what your dark name is or your personal name is, and maybe at the time of your death, there may be nobody who would know what is your personal name, the one which you were called by when you were a young child. The personal name, therefore, Gates says, is an intensely private matter. I ever find it interesting that Gates uses this as an intensely private matter, because the issue here is not private in the Western modern sense, but something which is used when you are very young and which ceases to be your defining naming entity as you grow up. And he gives the example which I've already told you, that as you grow up, fewer and fewer people remember you, and when they disappear, it disappears with the person. This is a story of most people. As you grow older, you realize that many people would not know what you were called by when you were young. Then you have the birth order names, that is, whether you were the firstborn or the second or the thirdborn. Again, in the language which I'm more familiar, very often you would call so-and-so brother the big brother, and the second would be the second brother or the major brother, and the third would be the shejo brother, etc., or the sister for that. Something which is again defined in birth order. Individuals and the elder brother may not have a very different relationship to say maybe the third brother or maybe the youngest brother. And I sort of shift focus a little bit to go back to where we began about the socially constructed nature of the individual and how we learn to be an individual. And I quote from Ramachandra, who is a scientist. He says that human beings at birth are totally dependent. Unlike, when the duckling hatches, the little duckling grows, flaps its wing, and then starts moving. Likewise, foals, still dripping with amniotic fluid, spends a few minutes buckling around to get the feel of their legs, then they join the herd. Human beings are not like that. We mature glacially, very, very slowly. We learn how to stand maybe in a year or a year and a half. We learn to talk much later. We learn to do so many things over a period of time. So a learning process is under constant supervision. We learn this from culture. And what is culture? It consists of massive collection of complex skills and knowledge which are transformed from person to person through to core mediums, language and imitations. We learn through imitation how to behave like somebody else. We become aware not just about ourselves but about others. We become aware of what the others may think about oneself. And therefore, Ramachandran says, a self that is not aware of itself is an oxymoron. We are selves with selfhood because we are aware of who we are. So if I grow up with the idea that I am not very bright, I have learned that from my peer, my family, my neighbors, my school, my teachers. My selfhood is constituted by its relationship to the others. The greatest scholar of our times who have referred to this relationship between mind, self, and society is George Herbert Mead. He taught us that just as we learn to make sense of ourselves, to walk, to speak, to communicate, to reflect, we also learn about society and about the others. We are not born with ready-made selves. We are born with selves which we learn to adjust, to accommodate, to imitate, and learn over a period of time. Human selves are constituted in dynamic relationship with society. This is an ongoing process. George Herbert Mead, in his pioneering book, Mind, Self and Society, articulates that just as we learn about ourselves, we learn about society. Just as we think, we also learn about how others think. It is a simultaneous process. It is a process which is captured at the same moment of time. Because if we don't have ideas about who the others are, we won't know about how ideas about ourselves. And he gives this interesting example of a dog fight. And he said dogs, when they're fighting with each other, a lot of it is intrinsic, it's almost instinctive. They don't have a symbolic world with which they communicate, saying, okay, if I get attacked by so and so in that dark lane, I should turn right and go somewhere else. That is, we as human beings operate with ideas, and this idea is communicated to others through gesture. So he gives the example, if you put a fist and show it to somebody, the other person knows that I am showing anger. That's not how the other non-human beings, to the point that we are aware of, operate. He therefore introduces the idea of significant symbols or gestures, which would include the language which we use, which would include the kind of facial expressions that we have, include maybe the kind of clothes which we wear on different kinds of occasions. And the dog fight example of Mead distinguishes the act of a dog fight, which is automatic, with what is done as a gesture with great deliberation or thought or reflection. The question is, did the dog converse internally the way we converse internally, or is it something that they operate completely different? Now, how do we learn to be social? How do we learn to be selfhood? We learn through various kinds of group, schooling, family, other kinds of institution. This is a kind of process which I will develop later in the next class when I talk about groups, when I talk about social institutions like education, family, kinship, etc., where we elaborate about the relationship about others and selfhood. But today, for example, I'll give just one example of how gender identities are socially constituted, with an example of gender socialization. So the moment a child is born, you're made to wear certain kind of clothes, you're expected to behave in a particular kind of ways, and this kind of family response gets reiterated in schools. Certain kind of games are supposed to be appropriate for girls, certain kind of rules are supposed to be appropriate for boys. This gender socialization leads to a certain kind of continuity between gender socialization within the family and learning of associated roles in school. Here, therefore, we have to note, I'm sorry that I went back, I think this PPT is wrong, you can just ignore it. But the point that I'm trying to tell you is that we have to, come to a conclusion where we are saying that the main point that I have tried to communicate to you is that individuals are not necessarily completely autonomous. They are free, at the same time they are constrained. We have choice, we are at the same time constrained. We have agency, at the same time the structure of our society determines how much choice we have. Thank you very much.